All right. Thank you to everyone who's joined us this morning. I'm from Randwick City Council and I'm excited to be here today co-hosting with Madeline Winter for this workshop about setting limits and building cooperation with teens and tweens. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal and Bidjigal peoples who traditionally occupied the Sydney coast. On behalf of Randwick City Council, I acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people attending today, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I will now hand over to Madeline, who will take you through this workshop.
Thank you very much. Welcome. Welcome for taking time out of your busy days. I had no idea what busy meant until I became a parent, so thank you for taking the time. Welcome with assistance from Google Translate, as I'm language disabled and only ever learnt English, so let me know if anything there's not right. Good. And I'd like to acknowledge country and show my respect to the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work and play. They're the Wongal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present and acknowledge that Indigenous culture survives and thrives and that we have all gained from what they have lost. And before we begin, you're all on silent. Kiara's my assistant. If you need help, use the chat function. And if you have questions, I think there's a Q&A. Is that separate from the chat? Okay. So pop your questions in the Q&A, and I hope we'll have time at the end to get to them. Kiara, some of you sent some questions in, so I've got them organised in case anyone doesn't have any particular questions today. So, and usually I'll get Kiara to read those questions out because I don't think that they're visible to everybody. And this is where it's very important to start as a parent, that you are a good parent and you've always done the very best that you can. If you could have done different, you would have. And as a parent, you face very real struggles and difficulties to do with how things are organised and your own history and the general circumstances and the kind of child you've got. And you're not to blame for those struggles. They're your responsibility to handle, but you're not to blame. And the longer I work with parents, the clearer it is to me that at least one of the main difficulties is how bad we feel about ourselves. I like to say it gets legs. We probably always had a little bit of that hanging around, but once we're parents and we're our struggles are affecting the people we love most, we can end up feeling really bad about ourselves, and that gets in the way of our ability to fix things up when they need to be fixed up. And someday you'll get a little rest. And I'm the parent of a 21-year-old, so I notice how much work it is to have little ones. So maybe it's a little easier, assuming that you're all here with slightly older kids. But I don't know. I don't know that you ever stop being a parent. And this is my dear husband who likes our friend's couch a lot. So, and after the webinar, we will upload this to a Randwick City Council's online, and I'll send you out some resources and information and a link to a free 20-minute consultation if you're wanting to talk some more. It's good to be able to make sense of what I've got to say today in the context of your particular family. And one of the things I love about the approach that I work with, which is called hand-in-hand parenting, is that it's a set of tools, but they're able to be used very flexibly. depending on what's happening now and on what's going on in what the challenges are in your particular family. So just as a general bit of information, if you're looking for resources around parenting, the Randwick City Council has a great page with a regular program of events for parents and families. And as I said, YouTube was where you'll find this, but we'll send you a link. And what I want to do today is talk about some tools that we have found work well to build cooperation and set workable limits as your child gets older. I want to talk about how things are shifting now that your kids are heading. I'm assuming your children are somewhere between 9 and older. And depending on where they're at, things are changing as their bodies change and their brains change. And those mean that we need to shift in how we're thinking about our parenting and how we respond to them. So I want to talk a little bit about adolescence. I want to talk about what limits are and why children need them and young people need them. And the idea of a relationship bank account, because basically how well things go in your household and how well your relationship with your kids go depends on the level of connection that everyone feels. And it's partly about balancing connection with limit setting. And I like to think about it as a bank account. You can put deposits in and you take deposits out, but I'll talk a little bit more about that. And the bonus, which probably none of you really are foreign to, is that you get to, I'll talk about handling upsets. The short version is upsets are part of the process, and understanding that makes a really big difference to how you handle what happens when you need to set a limit. It's not a sign necessarily that there's anything wrong if at least one person's upset. So I've done lots of different things. This is my daughter rather a long time ago. It goes very quick. So I've done all sorts of different things. The best thing I ever did was become a parent. It was later than I would advise, but better late than never. And I had the advantage of having worked with families using these tools and this approach for quite a long time before I became a parent, which I think made a really big difference. But I was inspired to, and once you become a parent, you're connecting with other parents all the time. And but I was, even though I'd worked with other families, just seeing how this approach made sense with this person who'd never attended a class, who'd never been told how to do very much at all, she really knew what to do. And that it just inspired me to, it gave me confidence, I think, in sharing this with other parents. So hand-in-hand parenting's been around for about 50 years. It was started in the US. It is all over the world. And we teach, I call it the love triangle. So we teach tools for connecting, which can be used between you and your child, or you can use them anywhere, but between an adult and a child, we teach tools for connecting, which are about putting a child in charge in a very structured way, a bit less structured as they get older, but I'll talk about that. And that is a place that builds your relationship and that builds your sense of, your child's sense of trust in you, which is really, really important. So we teach tools of special time, which is a certain kind of playing, play listening, which is a bit less structured, but the principles are fundamentally the same, and what we call stay listening, which is being prepared to listen to upsets. On the other side of it are the tools for correcting your kids and possibly anyone when they are what I would say is off track. I don't think there's a definition of what's off track. There's not a good and a bad, although we probably all agree about some things. The principle really is what's workable now, and if someone can't do what's workable, why? So what happens when you set a limit, and we'll explore this further as we spend a bit of time together today, is that you're basically interrupting someone whose behaviour is off track, principally because there's feelings involved. And when we set a limit, it works as when it works well, it works as a process for resolving emotional tension. So limit setting's a way of doing that. You can actually do limit setting playfully, and we may have time to talk about that, but it's a tremendously powerful thing to be able to do, partly because it sets a limit, it creates a limit, it brings a limit to a situation. But if you can do it playfully, it's very connecting. So you get a double bonus. And again, listening to the upsets that are the result of having had to intervene and bring a limit around something, that's part of the process, and we have tools for knowing what to do when your kids are upset. In order to do all of that, you really need support, and we teach a listening tool, a parent-to-parent listening tool called a listening partnership. But whether you can set that up with someone, it's fairly simple. There are some guidelines that we've found over time really are important to agree to, but whatever you're doing in your parenting, you're really going to need somewhere to go and offload about how it all feels, about thinking about what you want, what your goals are, how you're feeling, and sometimes a chance to talk about what was going on for you when you were younger, because that turns out to have a really big effect on how you set limits and why you set limits. Your own story is really important. And so we teach a peer-based listening process where you can take turns listening to one another in a structured way that helps you to keep your thinking clean instead of full of your feelings about stuff. So there's a relationship bank account, briefly. Generally, I would say if in your relationship with your kids, you have a lot of struggles and limits, and things are difficult most of the time, it probably means that the connection credit, so connection is the currency in your bank account, the connection credit is low. And if things are going well and appear to be going smoothly and everyone feels close and it's easy to get things done, then that generally will mean that there's plenty of connection credits in your relationship bank account. It can get tricky because families, like each of your kids, have a relationship bank account with you. You probably have a whole family bank account. Sometimes you can borrow from someone else in the family's credit that they've built. If there's a big limit that needs to be set, it's a group project, really. But it's important to understand that generally, if you need to set limits, you need credit in the bank because limits use credit. So, and again, you want to keep the balance with enough connection that things go well, and when they don't go well, you can correct them with a limit in a way that's workable and successful. And the general tone of things moves more towards cooperation than struggle. And sometimes it's not because you are doing anything wrong, but that something has come in from outside on the family that you didn't choose, that's basically chewing up connection credit. I have to say, the actual experience of adolescence is one of those things, which I'll talk about in a minute. So just to orient us, there's two things I'm trying to do in this webinar, which is cover off the basics of how we think about limit setting and the importance of maintaining and building a relationship with an adolescent and understanding adolescence. So I'm hoping we'll get through enough of both of those that you'll come out of it with a sense of what to do. But as I said, please get in touch. I love to hear from you, and we can kind of work out what you might need to do in your family. But basically, I think we used to think about adolescence as something, 13 to 19, and it turns out that it's something which lasts a lot longer. And in fact, the brain reconstruction that starts somewhere between 10 and 12, that doesn't finish until about the mid-20s, and apparently a little later for young men generally. So it means that the brain launches into this hugely demanding process of basically pruning away all of the neural pathways that haven't been much, they've been accumulated over early childhood but haven't been much used, and then strengthening those neural pathways which are being used so that everything gets sharper, perhaps a little bit less flexible, but sharper. And different parts, it's clunky. So I will talk a little bit, I'll refer a little bit to the work of Dan Siegel, who's a neuropsychologist, psychiatrist, I think, who's written a couple of books that are quite useful. They have their limitations, but they're quite useful. And I really love this analogy. It's a construction site, not a faulty building. So different parts of the brain come online at different times. And there's a number of things that characterize the adolescent brain in general and character in general. But sometimes it's a bit clunky. An example is that apparently the capacity to read verbal cues comes on a long time before other things that can balance those cues. So if your non-verbal cues are tense, your adolescent will read that before anything that comes out of your mouth, and won't have the capacity that they'll react to that piece of information because that part of brain processing isn't well connected to a bunch of others that put things in context, that can remember what the history is, etc. So it tends to be a bit clunky, and you can't rely on a sort of straight line of thinking or an adult line of thinking. Not that that's always good, but anyway. So that whole process is intensely demanding and actually chews up a whole bunch of your child's capacity, really. It's very important, but it means that a child who might otherwise have been really easy and relaxed when they were younger, suddenly things get a whole lot more difficult because basically there's just less resource, there's less of a deep sense of connection and well-being. There's just this very demanding internal process going on. It's worth keeping in mind as you try to engage. So I love foul language comics. He is a I don't know what you call him, a comiker who provides every kind of sort of comment on parenting that you could wish for. So this is where things sometimes end up, and you're going to need to do quite a lot of translating. Yes, so just to reference Dan Siegel's work again, he talks about the essence of adolescence. He talks about the sort of drivers of adolescent experience, which are increased emotional spark. So young people at this stage of development are likely to get excited faster, get upset faster, and it's to do with what's going on in their brain. They're also beginning to be deeply oriented towards social engagement, which may not have you at the centre of it, but what's going on in their social life and in their social circle and their connection with other young people is going to be just escalated hugely. They're also inclined, and it's to do with the way different bits of the brain develop, they're also inclined to seek novelty seeking, and connected with that is a tricky capacity to assess risk, which makes their judgment unreliable, and is probably where you're going to need to set limits for safety. And then in addition to that, young people are oriented towards creatively exploring the world in ways that generate all sorts of new understandings and in ways that we as a world need. So they bring something very important to the world. Unfortunately, there are a number of things that make it challenging for a young person at this stage of development to have a deep sense of, basically it's a sense of connection and well-being. Young ones get a bad rap, perhaps because of their wonky risk assessment process. They get into trouble, but they get bagged, and the general press around young people is not great. You'll hear stories of what they've done wrong rather than stories of what they've done right. So stories about where the risk-taking is off the charts, but not where the creative exploration has just developed something completely new and different. In general, they're coming out of a period where they were not well respected. Our culture doesn't respect young people well. They've spent years at school being told what to do, way beyond the point at which they were ready to be able to take more charge and be more in control. And as they get bigger, we often have quite harsh expectations of them, and I'll talk a bit more about that. There's also just young people make sense of the world through play and make friends through play. Play is tremendously important, and it actually doesn't stop being important when they're getting older, but there's just a lot less room for it, and it's less permissible, and that's hard on, I think it's actually hard on all human beings, but it's particularly hard on young people. Boys in particular increasingly are separated from simple affection. You have to sort of man up, and that's hard on people. Any issues that have been hanging around and difficulties from childhood will be carried into adolescence and often get supercharged at that point. Also, we have all learned by the time we're in late childhood to basically squash our feelings down. The expression of feelings in a simple cry gets to be less and less socially acceptable, and that doesn't help. And the other thing that I don't hear talked about nearly enough is that our young people are looking out towards a world that's really got enormous challenges, and they're not really watching us get well organised around dealing with those challenges, and that's really hard on them. The world is in a mess, and it's hard to be looking towards the next 60 years of your life with that in front of you. It certainly didn't. There were challenges when I was young. I'm 62, but nothing like what's going on now. And I think that drags young people down. Connected with that, we're in an interesting place as parents. We tend to be more isolated in our parenting now that our kids are older. They're more independent. We're less around other parents in the business of organising our kids. And the challenges that young people are bumping into are often more complex and difficult, and we may be less inclined to be sharing those experiences with other parents for fear of harsh judgment. So we're generally a bit less well supported at this point. We've often got really busy towards sort of later childhood when our children are more independent, and we might be picking up our working life again with much more energy and dedication than we were able to do when they were little, and that gives us less resource for them and for family life, and they can tell. We also struggle we're incredibly smart, but we're also really, really dumb. And our brains, I think, sometimes just can't tell the difference. So we look at our kids and they look big and we think they're able to do stuff, but actually, whether in terms of their experience of the world and in terms of what's going on in their brains and the major reconstruction that's happening there, they're actually not able to do things that we think they ought to be able to do because they're the size of an adult now. The other challenge is that we were young once, and pretty much our brains make sense of the world by looking back to see what we know, and we will, when we're presented with a situation, and we'll look back to see what we know. If what comes up is a clean amount of information, our brains will sort out what the difference is between what happened in the past and what we know from our past experience, what's in front of us, and we'll formulate a response that's completely flexible and structured for what's in front of us now, based on what we already know. When we have had a hard time and we go back to pull up what we know, what we tend to pull up is that experience at an often unconscious level of that hard time. And adolescence, I think most of us were not as well supported as we could have been. And we're parenting in general, you have this child in front of you, they're 4, they're 7, they're 8, they're 15. You're going to be reminded at levels you may not be aware of what it was like for you when you were 4, 8, 7, 15. And you're pulling that up, and that can get confusing. The struggles that you had are different from the struggles your child has. And sometimes you'll have trouble sort of pairing that out. We also have an Achilles heel, which is that we love our children so much that we're very inclined to catastrophize. So some small difficulty now turns into, a common example of the way that shows up in younger children is, kids start to play with guns, and what they're doing actually is working through a whole bunch of complicated feelings and ideas and tensions in our culture about violence. But we get worried that the minute they touch a toy gun, they're going to turn into a murderer. That's an extreme example, but that's what our parent brain does a lot of the time. So we worry. Find me someone who's worried, they're probably a parent, and we tend to catastrophize, and we can, especially at this stage, tend to focus on the negative, and we really have to work on focusing on what our kids are doing well and what's going well in our relationship with them. The other thing is there's history in our relationship with them, and that's there every time you interact with them. In particular, it'll be there every time you set a limit. So you'll be having to navigate that. Makes it more complex. Just the longer you're in the world, the longer your relationship has been going on, the more complex it is, the more issues are there from the past when you try to deal with something in the present. So what's good to know is that whatever comes out of their mouth, generally, our kids want the best for us. I like to say they want the best of us, and they want the best for us. And sometimes it's easy for us to forget this. A woman some time ago, but it's a lovely piece of research where she interviewed a lot of young people. And her publication is full of all these wonderful quotes of young people talking about what they want for their parents. And I like this one even more than the desire to spend time with them, and that's paramount. Young people want their parents to be less stressed and less tired. So looking after ourselves at this point is really important. And I like to ask this question. So how is your essence? How is your emotional spark, your social exploration, your novelty seeking, and your creative exploration? How are those things going in your life? Because that's what will give your young people great confidence if your life is in good shape. And the question is, have you lost your sparkle? It's pretty hard not to have lost a bit of sparkle by this stage, but what adolescents, this is Dan Siegel again, what adolescents have going for them that's both a challenge and a gift is actually what adults need in order to maintain vitality in their lives. It's deeply reassuring and inspiring to young people to see us have good lives and to see us in good shape. The other important thing to understand is that your role is changing. Basically, when your kids were little, you were the sun around which they orbited. And in particular, when we talk about a very powerful connecting tool called special time, when your kids are little, you can rock up to them pretty much any time and offer them this kind of playtime, which we'll talk a little bit about later, but it's basically a playtime where a child gets to choose what they want to do. They know how long they've got your attention for, and you've decided to follow their lead and be enthusiastic and basically, you know, hold in check any sort of negativity and criticism you might be tempted to offer, and hold in check your general habit of being in charge of everything. That little kids will just be delighted to have you generally if you can turn that on. Older kids are not so inspired by it. And in fact, what's happening is you're moving from being the sun around which they orbit to the heater in the room. And what's important to know about is just as important. But what's important to know about it is that they will notice when you aren't there, just like when a room starts to get cold. So you need to change how you offer your connection with them so that it makes sure that they can tell you're there when they need them. And it's part of how things change developmentally. They need to be more in charge of when it is that you connect and how it is that you connect. And that's part of what they need in order to grow up. When they're little, they're pretty happy to follow your lead around that. So down to limit setting. I think it's important for people to understand that that limit setting is a process. It's not a categorical statement of what you want, and that's it. That's part of it. Or you might have a negotiated agreement about what the limit's going to be as your child gets older. But just because there's a limit stated, and just because at some point there may be a limit that's been agreed is correct and accepted, you know, an acceptable limit from your child's point of view, doesn't actually mean that that's all there is to do. That's actually just the very first step in a limit setting process. And in general, I think it's useful to think about it as a 3-step process. You need to set the limit, and you'll do that in different ways depending on your child's capacity. And as they get older, they'll probably need to be more involved in what that limit is. But you need to understand that there are times when just knowing that there's a limit doesn't actually make it happen, that you actually need to bring the limit, and then sometimes you need to hold the limit. And there's a process that happens often when you do that well, that results in cleaning out basically whatever's in the way of having what you want, what you or your child, you know, whether you've decided on it collaboratively, want to have happen actually happens. I think we get very caught with thinking that because we've set the limit, that therefore anything else is just defiance. And actually our responsibility for implementing the limit extends much further than that. I haven't got a slide about this, and I probably don't have much time to talk about it, but I do want to just highlight. I think that the language of boundaries is not useful. I think it's much better to think about what needs to happen in terms of a limit setting framework, which I will explain today. The problem with boundaries is that it's sort of like it gets stuck at the first step. I've set my boundary, and the implication is that you'll respect it. And you basically, in that process, you've given the control in the situation over to the other person. The issue becomes whether they will respect it or not. If you can think about the same interaction in a limit setting framework, you can set the limit. I'm not going to drive you anywhere today. If that's you can't use the car, you know. And if necessary, you may need to put some pieces in place that actually make that limit happen. You may need to put the car key, I mean, depending on what the deal is, you might need to put the car keys in the safe. And it's not that they've disrespected you, it's that you need to stay in charge of the process, because you're the one who has to bring the limit and hold the limit. I hope that is clear, and hopefully if it's not, it'll become clearer, but I think it's really important to understand. Connected with that, we have some ways of thinking about limit setting that are not dealing with communication, I think, that are not all that useful and that are useful to be clear about. So I like to talk about two different frameworks for understanding the problem. The first is a cognitive framework, and it assumes that the problem is a lack of understanding or information. And this is most of how we deal with difficulties with other people. We generally start repeating, or anyway, I'll keep going. So the assumption is it's a lack of understanding or information. And so the solution to the problem is to explain more, give more information, and give a lot of words. And I've got the ... there because what tends to happen once we talk about limit setting with 5 words or less, right? And once we start doing more than 5 words, we're often talking about how we're feeling. And there's a place for that, but it's probably not in the middle of limit setting. We can talk about that later. But basically, to keep yourself out of trouble, you probably need to be confining the limit at the point where it's having to be implemented to 5 words. Your kid probably understands quite clearly what the problem is, what the situation is, what you want. They've probably heard it a million times. And trying to get them to agree with you that what you want is a good idea is an exercise in trying to get them to think about something when they've already shown you that they're not thinking very well, because you wouldn't have to be setting the limit if they were thinking well about what's workable now. So it's important. Information and understanding is important, but it's way overrated. And the framework that we use for understanding the problem is an emotional framework. So the problem in many, many cases is that feelings, theirs and I have to say ours, get in the way of thinking and cause relationship difficulties and ruptures and a sense of disconnection. And that's the problem we need to address. And it generally isn't addressed with a lot of words. The solution is to figure out how we can reconnect and allow feelings. And if we do that well enough, we'll find that between us and them, we and our child can work out a workable solution to the problem. It may not be what you want, but it is going to be workable, and that's the critical thing. So understanding that, I advise that you don't get lost in words, that if you're using more than 5 words, you're trying to convince someone who's already shown you that they're not in a place where they're ready to be convinced. They may get there, but there's a process they need to go through, and maybe you need to go through. And that process is to do with connection. So when people feel connected, they can use their thinking brain. And a sign that they aren't feeling connected is that things get difficult and they're off track and you need to set a limit. When someone feels disconnected and they've gone off track, I like to say your first line response is going to be different from probably what you want to do. What we want to do is set the limit and have them comply. And sometimes we get stuck in thinking the problem is with understanding. The analogy is a bit like when someone can't understand you because they speak another language. I don't know how many times I myself have made the mistake and have seen others of making the mistake of saying the same thing in English louder. And it's like that's not going to help. That's not addressing the underlying problem, which is that we are both speaking a different language. Limits and words are similar. So the first thing you need to pay attention to is what is the state of connection credit in your relationship, because limit setting will reduce the connection credits. We use a tool called Special Time, which I'll talk about a bit more later, or in the next slide. It works best with younger children in a highly structured way. You announce it, you time it, they know how long they've got you there, they know what the agreement is, and they'll use your attention under those conditions very powerfully. Once a child's heading into adolescence, and where this begins to happen depends with the child. If you can get away with using Special Time formally, hi, I've got 20 minutes, I've got half an hour, I've got an hour. It gets longer with bigger kids. They've got more complex things they want to do generally. But what do you want to do? And be prepared to offer resource, be pleased with what they want to do, and yeah, follow their lead. If you can do it that way, ideally put a timer on so everyone knows how long it's going to take, and do it that way. As kids get older, for a whole bunch of reasons that I haven't got time to go into, approaching them that directly often doesn't work. So you need to understand that the time you spend in their presence, where you're not demanding anything of them and where you're paying attention to what they're interested in, that is really important. That is often what Special Time looks like once kids are older, and you may not be able to announce it because they're so busy with what's going on inside themselves, they're not really interested in what you're doing. But they do know that you are there. So times where you are getting to hang out, you want to make yourself available without imposing yourself on them. So be around in the house, not be doing something, have periods of time where you're not doing something where you can't be interrupted. Have times with them where you really conscientiously decide not to have any agenda. There's no place that you have to be. Low intensity family time it's always important, but it becomes particularly important at this stage of parenting. And you really want to work on eliminating the negative and emphasizing the positive. All those little things that you want to pick at, you could put yourself on a diet for a couple of weeks and really, initially, I would just write down all those things you think you need to point out and see what happens if you don't do that for 2 weeks. Because your adolescent child's sense of connection is so precarious, they really, it doesn't work to be constantly chewing away at the connection credit in your relationship. So you may have to give up on some things that are precious to you. Ultimately, I think the question becomes, what are the safety issues? That's one way that you can kind of try to figure out what's important. But anyway, paying attention to the connection credit in your relationship is the first line of defense. If you haven't done that, the limit setting probably won't go well. So special time with teens is adult to child one-on-one. Generally, they need a connection injection of you, and they ideally need it with each of the important adults in their life every now and again. You ask them, what do you want to do? And you let them lead, and you do it willingly and be delighted with your child for the time that you are doing it. You don't have to say it's special time, but you could. See what happens when you do. They may turn you down. They need to negotiate when it happens in a way that a little kid doesn't. And if your child wants to do things, the next question will be, what if they want to spend a whole lot of money or something? If you do have to, come and talk to me before you start setting a whole lot of limits around it, because it's really ideally a limit-free zone. But if you do need to set limits, set them outside of the actual time you're spending together. So we're only going to spend $20. We're only going to drive. What do you want to do that we can get there in 20 minutes? Sort of set the parameters before you get into it, rather than having to be saying no when you're in it. It gets a little bit less clear when you're not doing formal special time, but these are the general principles. What you really don't want to do in this time is bring up difficult subjects, take over and tell them what they should be doing, or ask prying questions, pass judgment, or refer to difficulties in their or your life. This is not the space for that. The space for that may become clearly available when you've after special time. It's interesting what happens often after special time. But yes. So generally, you'll need to be focusing on connection credits rather than connection killers. So eliminate the negative, emphasize the positive, understand that if they could, they would. And this is my key thing for parents of older children around setting limits. If you can't be cheerful, it's probably not going to work, because once you've stopped being cheerful around what needs to happen, and at this point you may in fact need to be doing a lot of reminding, and it can slip into nagging really easily. If you can keep your tone cheerful rather than resentful and whatever else, it's serving a useful function, but it's not telling them about how shitty you feel, to be blunt. That's not going to go well, because it's introducing how you feel into this limit setting process. How you feel about things may be something that you can have a discussion about in a different context, but bringing your feelings into the limit setting isn't ideal. It is almost inevitable. Sometimes it will get quite messy, and I think we have to give ourselves permission for it to be a little messy. But generally, the watchword is cheerfulness. So I'll talk a bit more about that. So basically, in this model, it's feelings, it's emotional tensions which are getting in the way of figuring out a workable solution. So when difficult feelings come up, we tend to feel disconnected and without a sense of well-being and confidence in our connection with someone and in our relationship with them. And at that point, we're not in our, what I call our thinking brain, we're in our feeling brain. And that's the challenge that you have to deal with when you're coming to set a limit. As I've said already, if they could, they would. Feelings are in the way. You need to make this fundamental assumption. Like, if they could, they would. So what's in the way? Generally, feelings are in the way. What you need to hold out are warm limits. So warm and cheerful. Because most of us struggle around limit setting because it was set in harshness with us. And almost, like, I quite struggle for a really warm tone of voice when I'm trying to set a limit. I do well enough, and I have a lot of connection credit in my relationship with my daughter, so it can weather the places where I'm a little less than elegant. And that is one of your insurance policies, is if your relationship has good connection, it doesn't have to be perfect. The process doesn't have to be perfect, but the limit needs to be warmly brought instead of meanly brought. And this is where I'm not going to talk about this here, but rewards and consequences, my short version is don't do it. It tends to just eat away at connection credits. When someone's upset, when feelings are in the way, which is a sign of which is that you're needing to set a limit, they're possibly not going to care about whatever the reward or the consequence was, or not be able to remember. So it looks like a quick route to getting things how you want them, but it does, if it works a bit, it won't tend to work long term. But if that's hard to understand, definitely come and have a chat with me, because it's, you know, it's common advice around in the world that, you know, people are motivated by rewards, and they're much more motivated by a sense of connection and confidence in and for them. So warm limits and expectations. Limits use credit. So you need lots of connection credit in your bank account. And I like this way of thinking about the challenge you have in front of you. They need warm expectations and scaffolding and support in order to achieve, sometimes with some things, in order to achieve what needs to be done. So the homework might be a common challenge. The scaffolding and support would be the space to do it in, reminders about time. If there's a particular subject area they're really struggling with, you might get them some help around the technicalities of that particular subject area. The expectations are about saying you can do this, and being prepared to be warm in that and understanding that upsets may follow. So the thing that so I've got a few watchwords here: cheerful, warm, and relaxed high expectations. I think young people need high expectations and can rise to those expectations given the right kind of support. But they need to be relaxed high expectations, not ones that are about their goodness or badness, not ones where there's bad consequences, mean consequences. Sometimes there's just consequences, but mean consequences if they don't achieve the thing that is being held out. For most of us, if we got high expectations as young people, they were tense. And there was a whole lot of emotional tension around them that actually got in the way and didn't help us build resilience and flexibility and competence around achieving things and being confident that we can. So, keep losing track of my pointer here. When you run into trouble, there's good reasons for it. There's good reasons for it. Part of the challenge is that stressful experiences create emotional tension. And that emotional tension can sometimes migrate and snowball. It will tend to drive off-track behaviour. And sometimes something that happened in the past, or it can be a long time in the past, or it can be just quite recently. Sometimes something quite big has happened, but we talk about pretexts, which are much easier to understand with little kids, although I know plenty of adults who get uptight about the most amazingly petty things. But little kids will choose something like, the wrong colour socks and have a huge upset about it. And we understand that as they're using this thing, which really doesn't make sense to be that upset about, as a pretext for some much bigger upset that they can't necessarily articulate or talk about. So feelings from the past can tend to come up in upsets about other things that often don't make a lot of sense, big feelings about little things. They're at school every day. I have to say, one of the things about school, almost the minute your kid gets into school, it's this pressure around which the family has to get organised. And part of the challenge of it is that pretty much school takes up a lot of the sort of limit setting slack your child has. So by the time they come home, there's just a lot less flexibility, and they're backed up often. So it's hard being young. I think for most of us, it's a long time since we spent day after day in an environment where we had as little control as young people have at school. But, in general, young people don't have the resources or the freedom to do the things they'd like to do. And sometimes that's necessary, but sometimes it's just because it's convenient for us, and that's tricky for them. And being convenient for us isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's going to generate tension if other people want something different or need something different. The other thing that's going on for them is that as we get older, we get conditioned, often quite forcefully, not to show our feelings when we're upset. And it turns out that showing your feelings when you're upset is actually a necessary process to releasing them and resolving them and getting to the point where your thinking isn't quite so contaminated by them. And not showing them doesn't mean they've gone away. Our culture is very confused around this, like that we're really big on distracting. So we'll distract someone from their feelings. To use a sort of non-parenting example, someone's very sad about a death in the family, and we'll offer them a cup of tea. And often that's about how uncomfortable we are with their sadness because it reminds us of ours. But we're sort of hopeful that if they get their attention away from it, it won't be such a problem. It's kind of a complicated process, but basically the feelings need to be felt. And when that happens, people can think better. And we live in a culture that's really not about feeling feelings. It's about, I don't know, it's just doesn't work that easily. And our job as parents is to try and figure out how to help our kids process those feelings so that they've got the confidence to get on with what they need to get on with, or we can have things happen in our household that are workable. So warm limits, after your first line of defense, which is connecting, warm limits are your second line of response when your child is off track. I've tried hard to find photos of parents interacting with adolescent children, older children. It's actually quite difficult to find. I love this photo because, like, there's a safety limit here. This little one's heading in the wrong direction on this bench, but the lightness with which the dad restrains him or her is just very sweet, and I think exemplifies really what we want to aim for. There'll be times where we need to get in there fast and stop something dangerous happening, and that's imperative, and we need to understand that that's our responsibility at times. But most of the time, it's not a national emergency. Most of the time, a bit of guidance as the first sort of part of the limit setting process may be all that's necessary. And here he's offering this child a little bit of guidance, which the child may or may not take. So we need to ask ourselves, particularly with our older children, because every time we set a limit, it uses connection credit, we need to ask ourselves, is this limit really important? In particular, is this a safety issue? That gets to be very acute at this age and stage of parenting. Is this really important? Is it worth chewing away at the connection credit in my relationship to have this happen? I think we also need to ask ourselves, how am I feeling? Am I able to keep my tone cheerful? Sometimes you'll have to set a limit regardless. Sometimes you'll just feel impelled to set a limit regardless because you're so angry, and all of those things happen, and I don't think we want to give ourselves a hard time about it. So long as we're focusing on reconnecting and connecting and continuing to build the connection credits in our relationship with our children can handle us not being elegant. But if we know that we aren't going to manage a cheerful tone, around something that's not a safety issue, I think we need to really ask, can I live with it if this doesn't happen? And then the other really important thing is this a workable limit? So I talked about setting the limit or stating the limit, bringing the limit, which we'd probably talk about a bit more if we've got time. And then you have to be prepared to hold the limit. So, hang on, I'll go back. So, taking a 4-year-old to the supermarket and expecting them to not touch anything is an unworkable limit. One of the areas that almost every parent struggles with younger children, but in particular as our children get older, is limits around screen time. And I don't pretend to have quick fixes around that. I think it's a formidable enemy that we will have to keep navigating and thinking about and trying to understand and intervening around and having upsets with our children about if necessary. But it's not going to help you if you can't hold the limit. So if you don't want them to use the phone at night, if it's in their room, you're not going to be able to hold the limit. Or you may need to have some way of managing the internet so that it's off. Or, I don't know, it's complicated, and as I said, I don't pretend to have expertise there, but I think you do need to, you want to try and avoid getting yourself into a situation where you've set a limit that you can't hold. And the challenge of this phase of parenting, and it's a continuing challenge, it's one which you'll be navigating more and more as your children get older, is that you can't actually enforce everything in the way that you could when they were little. And you need to be managing the relationship and deciding what limits to set in that context in a way that you probably didn't have to when they were younger. So a key issue for parents of adolescents is, can you actually hold this limit that you're expecting to happen? And if you can't, what then? Anyway. And the next, and of course, the other question in whenever you're feeling pulled to set a limit is, how connected are we? How much connection credit is there in the relationship? And have I got enough there to use when I'm going to set this limit? As I said, there'll be safety issues sometimes, and you can't sit around assessing how connected you feel. But a lot of the time, if you haven't gone their way in a way that they can tell you're going their way, setting the limit will be harder than it needs to be. So lighten up, cheerful limit setting, don't sweat the small stuff. Your criteria are that they're safe, happy and well. Stop nagging. They would if they could. You'll need to change something about the way it's set up or the way that you are bringing or holding the limit. But nagging really is just going to undermine everything, and frankly, you're better off just doing it yourself. Stop supervising daily tasks. It chews away at young people's sense of connection. Be prepared to offer cheerful reminders. And I haven't talked about it in detail, but basically don't set up rewards and punishments. They just don't work long term. So the next piece is that when you set a limit, what that does is it provides something against which your child, who's running in front of feelings, pushes. It interrupts this behaviour which has been driven by feelings. And so what happens is the feelings come to an immovable barrier of some kind and are forced up to the surface. So the upset that happens is actually part of the process. It's a necessary offloading of emotional tension, which is getting in the way of thinking well about the situation. I think it's useful to think about those upsets as the pathway to cooperation. And with younger children, we talk about freedom of the mouth. When they are in the middle of the upset, you need to remember they don't mean it. And if they start targeting you, you're bigger than that. It's a badge of honour in some ways that they feel safe enough to show you how hard that struggle is. If your child's rude all the time, come and see me, because that's actually not an upset that's working well. There's not enough of a limit there to get that out in the open and deal with it. Basically, often young people are struggling with a sense of powerlessness in the face of a big feeling. It could be from a long time ago. You don't necessarily know what it is that's been pulled up in this upset. And sometimes the person who you've set a limit with will need to fight. They'll need to push in order to have a sense of being powerful in relation to this feeling. So your child may target you. And none of this is easy, and you will need support. You'll need somewhere where you can go and talk about it with someone who cares and who someone's not going to judge you, and someone's not going to judge your child for the upset that's happened. The upsets are more straightforward the younger your child is. As your children head towards adolescence, they're emotionally much more defended, and you're actually, when an upset comes up, you actually have to navigate that first. So upsets are rarely at this stage a nice, satisfying sob. They're usually a bit physical, grumpy, banging doors, etc. They're not pleasant, and they're often not that satisfying for us. But they are your child reaching for what's available to them to express and expel the feelings that are getting in their way. And it will pass. It's a storm that will pass. And you just need to hang in there with it. You need to keep things safe, but you don't necessarily need to do anything about it, and you don't necessarily need it to make it stop. What happened for you when you were upset as a young person will also be your point of reference, and that may make it difficult for you to hang in there with your kids when they're upset. But fundamentally, upsets are part of the process, and understanding that can help us find our way through them. Just a little primer on feelings. Tears relieve stress and grief. Tantrums are not well understood in our culture, but they're actually the way that human beings release frustration. And if you can let a tantrum go in a little one and let it run its course, they're often hot and fast. And out of it, sometimes a child can do something that they just could not do on the front side of the tantrum. We tend to read them as defiance, and that's not helpful. It may look like that, but it's a tantrum. Laughter heals fears, and there are some kinds of fears that are released in a physical process of shaking, or I think some of the stomping around that happens once our kids are a bit older can be about feelings of fear. And also by the time you're 9, 10, 11, 12, older, there's a very big sense of things not being fair. Children are very backed up on experiences of arbitrary control and a sense that things haven't been done fairly and right, and they'll find ways of telling you that. So you're working with a backlog. But giving anyone a chance to work through that set of feelings tends to have things go more smoothly and restores thinking and a sense of connection. And sometimes there can be quite a profound sense of connection once you've worked your way through an upset. We call that stay listening. So when your tween or your teen is upset, it's important to remember they aren't thinking, so they can't take care of safety. You're the safety manager. So move, move grandma's vase out of the way. Try and corral them into some space where they're not going to break anything. Stay as close as you can. Understand that what comes out of their mouth isn't something they mean at that point. They may get quite mean. They've been watching us for quite a long time and they know exactly what our buttons are. So it's important that you can try to remember not to take it personally. I talk about it being, there's two pieces to this process. One is our children who have a very, very sophisticated bow and a very sharp arrow. And the other is that we're walking around with a very big target and they're aiming their arrow at our target. And the project is both to blunt their arrow and to reduce the size of our target. So you'll get targeted if you can possibly remember not to take it personally. And once you stop being able to remember that, find yourself a listening partnership and tell them all about it. It's really important. The bit I haven't talked about a lot, but it's important to understand that you actually don't have to fix every problem that turns up. Sometimes just figuring out where the limit is and working through the upset that follows will resolve things. And as our children get older, the challenge of not moving in to fix it gets clearer and clearer. I think it's always a challenge for parents to understand that there's almost always an emotional component to any difficulty our child encounters, and we can hang in there and let them feel those things and don't have to immediately jump in to fix it. The thing as our kids get older is that it's often we can't fix it and we have to face something there. Or it's best to let them sweat. Anyway, it continues to be a problem, I can tell you. So when you're listening to upsets, they'll be loud. They may use strong words. It can be quite physical and dramatic, or it could be quiet tears and sadness. Sadness is tears. The bunch of other things is generally fear, in my experience. And stopping the upset doesn't stop the feeling. And you're going to need support for this to work. So you need a space where you can talk about your experiences as an adolescent. I actually think it's very useful listening partnerships with people who are not connected in your life. Hand in hand helps people set up listening partnerships, and it's amazing what people can do on the phone with someone, sometimes on the other side of the world. But sometimes I recommend for couples, if your relationship is in reasonable shape, it's very useful if you're parenting a child with someone else to take 5 minutes every week to sit down and listen to each other. There's some tips on my website about the rules for this kind of listening. But basically, especially with someone that you have a close relationship with, another adult you have a close relationship with, it's important that you stick to a topic. And I suggest the topic is what was it like when you were 12, if your child is 12? What was it like when you were 15? Because that's in your face as you try and navigate your child now. I like to say some of it we can remember, some of it we just breathed it in and we breathe it out with the same sense of not really being clear that it's something that wasn't so positive and that comes from the past. We also need a place where we can blow off steam and we can kind of, through that process, gain some perspective and make plans to reconnect in our relationship with our child. So get that support. You could find someone that you can swap some listening time with, and do feel free to get in touch with me. I'm really happy to have a short free consultation with anyone. It's great to actually talk to you about what's going on, and yes, do take advantage of that. We can figure out how this might work in your family or go through something that wasn't clear today. So, Kiara, I'm wondering if we have any questions that have come up.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box. The Q&A is having technical difficulties, which I reached out to IT.
As well.
Yeah, apparently it's to do with the new Teams update, but they should have access to the Teams chat if they have a question.
Okay. Well, people sent in a few questions, so I might use up. We'll see if anyone adds anything in the chat. But they had the same problem with the Q&A last time, I think.
Yeah.
Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm available, so please do get in touch. Really happy to chat with people.
Here we go. But we do have one question.
Okay.
They're just saying, I'd love Madeline to go over stating and bringing and holding limits.
Okay, cool. Okay, so don't eat the leftovers is stating the limit, right? Bringing the limit is, I don't know that's actually, bringing the limit, basically, I'll get away from the leftovers. We often clean up your toys. I'm thinking about younger children, but okay, I'm thinking about something with an older child. Please let me know what you're doing today. And that doesn't happen. So I've stated the limit, right? So I will need to take responsibility for connecting with my child and making sure I know what she's doing with her day. And a way that I might scaffold that and provide support along with a relaxed high expectation that she will tell me what she's doing with the day, is set up a calendar that she can fill in To bring the limit, I will need probably to cheerfully remind her that she needs to fill in the calendar so I know what she's doing. And I don't know about holding the limit here. Well, holding the limit might be, in this instance, holding the limit might be like, if you don't fill in the calendar, this sounds like a consequence. It gets complicated really fast. But if you don't fill in the calendar, I won't know you need the car and I will have to go and use it. So I'm holding the limit. I'm going to use the car here. I don't know if that's clear enough. With younger children, it's like we often think we can tell someone to do something from the other side of the room, and kids don't listen. So, I mean, turn off the television might be one of those things. And they're acting like you haven't even asked it. And so then you need to go and bring the limit closer. So you might put your hand on the remote control and say, we need to turn off the television. You could just turn the television off, but bringing the limit is a way that you can find that point at which you bump into the feelings without, you want to do that as gently as possible in the way that you bring the limit. So you might put your hand on the remote control and they're still looking at the screen as if you aren't in the room. And so then you have to bring the limit further and you turn off the television. And then to hold the limit, you might need to put the remote control somewhere out of reach, right? So yes, the tricky thing as our kids, I don't know if that's any clearer, the tricky thing as our kids get older is that there are some limits, like once they're able, there are some limits we can't hold. So you can't go to the shops, right? Actually, my friend has this challenge. Her child heads off to the shops after school, is in mid-high school. So she has to bring the limit. So she rings him up to find out where he is. She set the limit, you need to come home after school. He doesn't. She rings him up, where is he? You need to get on the bus and come home. It's clear that he's not going to get on the bus and come home. She needs to bring the limit. She'll get in the car and go and get him. And yeah, and it's not workable. That's a good example, actually. It's not workable to keep on saying you need to get on the bus and come home, because if he's not going to do that, he's not going to do that. So you need to do the next thing that brings the limit to him. And it's the, yeah, you need, yeah, I don't know if that's any clearer. But it's a good distinction, and it's sometimes, it's much clearer with little ones. And the thing I find with parents of adolescent children is that it's really easy to get caught trying to set a limit you can't hold. And there are some things that now that they're able to organise themselves, you really have to accept you can't control. And that's quite a challenge for most of us.
We just have a question following that.
Yeah.
They're just wondering, like, and do you do this all cheerfully? Because it's so tricky with teens.
Yes. The cheerful, I like to put that out there as a relaxed high expectation for parents. So it's a kind of watchword. If you're not, as I said, in the end, there'll be some times where we don't do this elegantly. And I think that parenting approaches which have a set of steps that you've got to implement exactly, or otherwise you've failed, aren't useful. It's a constant and flexible process of managing your relationship with your child. And it depends on a whole bunch of different things what you might do today. But in general, so you may lose your temper, and that isn't a good thing, but you don't deserve to give yourself a hard time about it. And if you've ended up in an interaction that hasn't gone well, you are not confusing anyone by trying to figure out and acting on an opportunity sometime in the near future where you get to connect again. You need to treat that as special time. So the rules there are, you don't mention sore topics, you don't give advice or talk about negative things in your relationship. That's not the space for talking about the difficulty. Talking about the difficulty may become easier once you've had a chance to reconnect. So if you lose it, the way you can apologize, you're welcome to, but the issue is more that, well, apologies are a whole complicated thing in themselves, because people often get upset at us when we apologize. That's actually part of the process. But if you're not cheerful, it's your little warning sign, it's your red flag that says you're upset. And when you're upset, it's a much less clear communication. It's not so much, it's a distraction from what the problem behaviour is, and from the limit that needs to be set, and from the upset that needs to happen possibly once that limit is set and brought and held. So if you're upset, it's going to get in the way. So if you're not cheerful, then it's probably just going to eat away at the credit in the relationship rather than achieve the goal you have in mind. And I was going to put this in earlier in the week. I was thinking about this and I forgot to put a slide in to say, the bottom line is, if what you're doing now isn't working, don't keep doing it. There's something that you need to do differently, and maybe you need a hand and someone, you know, come and spend some time with me, or find someone that you can talk through what's happening and how you might approach it differently. But yes, if the way you're setting limits isn't getting the results that you want, then there's work to be done for you that may make it possible to get where you want to, or to come to some workable agreement with your child about what's going to happen. But if you're not cheerful, it's a sign that it might be better if you just go for a walk, assuming that you're not up against a safety issue. Anything else?
That's all the questions in the chat at the moment.
Okay, well, we're nearly at time, really, so we should probably wrap up. I had a few questions. Feel free. This is what people asked: how to respond when your child says cruel things to you, which is, I think I've said, it's important not to take it personally, but if that's going on a lot, you could do with some help thinking about how to navigate it. Sibling stories are always complicated, but the short version is how they interact with each other has a lot to do with how connected they feel to you. So focusing on your connection with each of the kids is bound to make a difference there. Friendship difficulties get harder and harder, she says cheerfully, in that you just have less and less control over who your kid hangs out with. And I think, as a final note, what I'd say is, we underrate drastically the value of just shutting up and listening. If at all possible, say nothing. That we didn't get listened to. We often had people move in and try to solve problems in ways that weren't that useful. And that's what we pull up when our kids are in trouble. And we don't have a good point of reference for being well listened to. And people can work out their problems and their challenges for themselves if they're well listened to. And you will feel like that's not enough and that you'll need to do something else. And I reckon that at least 80% of what needs to be done is just that you are there and that you're prepared to listen, and you're not going to let it get into an argument. You're just prepared to listen. It's incredibly powerful tool. So I'll finish on that note. Thank you, Kiara. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Madeline, and everyone for attending.